When Senator Amy Klobuchar confronted Kash Patel with his own public record, what unfolded was not your typical political theater, but a striking collision between documented truth and relentless deflection. Every single day, thousands of FBI professionals start their mornings fully aware that the words they put into official reports will track them for the entirety of their professional lives. They understand that every single sentence can be scrutinized, challenged in court, subpoenaed, and read aloud back to them while under oath. They function within a rigorous framework where facts are absolutely mandatory, where memory cannot be conveniently selective, and where claiming not to have a document in front of them is not a defense, but rather a serious vulnerability. Therefore, we must ask ourselves what occurs when the individual nominated to command these agents suddenly refuses to stand by his very own publicly recorded statements. What happens when the strict standards demanded of field agents seemingly vanish when applied to the leader at the top? What you are observing here is not a standard confirmation process. It is a direct clash between undeniable documentation and well-rehearsed evasion. This was a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing, and theoretically, it should have been a standard affair filled with predictable inquiries about budgets, operational goals, and familiar talking points regarding the restoration of public trust and national security. These are the kinds of heavily scripted conversations that Washington has mastered over the years. Kash Patel entered that chamber with total confidence, likely assuming he would navigate this ordeal exactly as he had managed countless others in the past. He understood the tempo, the strategic pauses, the areas of pressure, and the exact moments to pivot or let the clock run out. Initially, this game plan appeared to be highly effective. He spoke eloquently about the men and women of the Bureau, using polished rhetoric to highlight their service, their immense sacrifices, and their unwavering dedication to the United States Constitution. He emphasized the importance of rebuilding credibility, ensuring the agency remains completely unbiased, and defending American citizens against all threats, whether domestic or international. Every response he gave was crisp, and every sentence felt practiced yet impactful. There was absolutely no indication that his smooth performance was about to hit a wall. An average viewer might have easily concluded that this nomination was coasting effortlessly toward a final approval. However, the entire atmosphere of the room shifted the moment the questioning was handed over to Senator Amy Klobuchar, and this shift did not require anyone to raise their voice. She did not immediately launch into an aggressive interrogation. Instead, she opened with a statement that initially felt like a moment of mutual agreement and alignment. She calmly expressed her deep respect for the Bureau, acknowledging the brave agents who put their lives on the line, and highlighting the fundamental institutional values that represent the agency at its absolute best. Her delivery was exceptionally measured, remarkably controlled, and purposely tranquil. It was the specific kind of calm that broadcasts deep preparation rather than any sort of hesitation. Then, keeping her voice perfectly level, she established a firm boundary that would dictate the rest of the exchange. She made it clear that this process was not a game, not a venue for keeping score, and certainly not a place for political retribution. She declared that this was about the ultimate safety of the nation and the preservation of a system that relies entirely on concrete facts, absolute truth, and statements that can be meticulously verified and strongly defended. In that precise moment, the entire context of the hearing transformed. The focus moved away from what Kash Patel promised to do in the future and locked on to what he had already stated publicly and repeatedly on the permanent record. Senator Klobuchar did not proceed with subjective opinions or loose interpretations. She moved forward with hard documentation. She stated that he had previously claimed a specific political figure had every right to assert that elections were rigged by the government. She then presented the most straightforward question imaginable, a simple yes or no, asking if he had indeed made that statement. There were no complex linguistic tricks, no hidden legal snares, just a clear-cut opportunity to either confirm or deny words that had already been widely attributed to him. This was the precise defining moment when a deeply revealing and fundamentally troubling pattern officially emerged from the shadows of the confirmation hearing, completely altering the trajectory of the proceedings. When confronted with his own past rhetoric, his immediate response was not a robust defense, nor was it a thoughtful reflection. It was simply a repetitive, hollow assertion that he did not have that specific, heavily scrutinized statement sitting directly in front of him on the witness table. He offered the committee absolutely no firm denial of the words attributed to him. He made zero attempt to clarify his past meaning or explain away any potential misunderstandings. He put forth no genuine effort to provide the surrounding context that he would later claim was so desperately missing. Instead of engaging with the reality of his own public history, he merely manufactured an artificial, calculated distance. He deliberately and systematically separated himself from his very own vocabulary. He sat before the highest legislative body in the nation and acted as though his own past claims, broadcasted to thousands or millions of listeners, required the physical manifestation of a printed piece of paper before they could even be perceived, let alone addressed or defended. Senator Amy Klobuchar, however, was exceptionally well prepared for this exact brand of political evasion. She absolutely did not take the bait to engage in a fruitless, screaming argument, nor did she display even the slightest hint of emotional frustration or performative outrage that so often plagues televised congressional hearings. She understood that anger is fleeting, but the official congressional record is permanent. Therefore, she countered his strategy of deliberate absence with a tactical maneuver far more devastating and inescapable than any heated, partisan argument could ever hope to be. She utilized pinpoint, surgical specificity. She did not rely on vague summaries or generalized accusations. Instead, she cited the exact, indisputable date, August 27, 2023. She named the exact, verifiable source, The Thrive Time Show. By doing so, she was not merely asking a question. She was firmly and permanently anchoring his controversial quote into an undeniable, verifiable reality that could not be simply waved away by a dismissive hand gesture. She then systematically and methodically added the necessary legal and historical context, pointing out clearly that numerous courts of law across the country, importantly including federal judges who had been appointed directly by conservative Republican administrations, had entirely, comprehensively dismantled and rejected those exact same election fraud claims. The judicial system had already evaluated the substance of the claims he promoted and found them completely lacking in fact. Yet, once again, Patel stubbornly refused to engage with the actual, underlying substance of the critical issue at hand. He retreated to his newly established defensive perimeter, repeating his rehearsed line that he simply lacked sufficient facts placed in front of him to offer a proper response. What is so critically and painfully missing in this highly choreographed exchange is not just a satisfying, complete answer to a senator's question. What is entirely absent is the most basic, fundamental willingness of a grown professional to take personal ownership of the statement itself. In absolutely any functioning system constructed around the core principles of integrity and accountability, especially within the realm of federal law enforcement, the preliminary, foundational duty of an individual is not necessarily to fiercely and flawlessly defend every single word they have ever spoken. The preliminary duty is simply to possess the basic courage to admit that the words are, in fact, yours. Recognizing exactly what he was doing, and before he could strategically recover his footing or attempt to pivot the narrative into safer political territory, Senator Klobuchar ruthlessly advanced to the next scheduled topic. She fully realized that she absolutely did not require his active, verbal confirmation to successfully build her overarching case against his nomination. She understood a fundamental truth of congressional oversight. Once hard evidence is formally and officially entered into the permanent congressional record, it stands completely independently of the witness's cooperation, agreement, or conveniently failing memory. With masterful pacing, she shifted the heavy focus of the room directly to the tragic and chaotic events of January 6th. Specifically, she highlighted the immense bravery of the courageous Capitol police officers who had previously sat in those very same committee rooms, raised their right hands, and provided harrowing, sworn testimony regarding the severe physical and emotional violence they had personally endured on that dark day. She looked directly at Patel and asked him a simple, piercing question. Had he publicly accused those specific, traumatized law enforcement officers of deliberately fabricating their stories and lying to the American public? Cornered by the gravity of the topic, he replied with a carefully calibrated statement, claiming that he did not believe that specific characterization of his words was entirely accurate. But as Klobuchar was rapidly proving, in the context of this high-stakes confirmation hearing, Factual accuracy was absolutely not a subjective matter left up to his personal, highly selective recollection. It was a matter of hard, recorded, undeniable evidence. Without missing a single beat, she immediately cited a heavily viewed March 2024 appearance on the immensely popular Joe Rogan podcast. She laid the evidentiary trap out clearly, meticulously, and without a shred of hesitation. Then, she utilized an absolutely brilliant and incredibly subtle rhetorical device that completely shifted the emotional center of gravity within the chamber. She deliberately inserted her own harrowing first-hand experience directly into the unfolding narrative. She stated, plainly and with quiet devastation, that she was physically present in the Capitol building on that terrifying day, and that she personally witnessed those battered officers acting as undeniable heroes in the face of an unprecedented assault. In that singular, breathtaking moment, the entire dynamic of the interrogation instantly and irreversibly changed. It was no longer a dry, abstract political debate about the nuances of casual podcast commentary. It transformed into a profound, glaring contrast between the lived, visceral trauma experienced by those who were actually under siege and the flippant, casual public dismissal peddled by a political commentator sitting safely behind a microphone years later. The methodical, relentless presentation of his own history continued unabated, with the introduction of a specific social media post from May 2024. In this digital publication, he allegedly referred to the brave individuals wearing the uniform of law enforcement as cowards, while simultaneously working to completely dismiss and downplay the undeniable severity of the January 6th events. Once again, the senator offered him another incredibly simple, straightforward, yes or no prompt. She was actively presenting him with yet another clear, unobstructed chance to take a definitive, principled stance on his own previously published beliefs. And yet, his response remained frustratingly, remarkably identical to the previous evasions. He once again claimed, with a straight face, that he simply did not have the necessary printed material resting in front of him to confirm his own thoughts. By the time this third occurrence unfolded, the repetition had completely ceased to be a minor, nervous quirk of a witness under pressure. It had fully solidified into a highly visible, deeply impenetrable defensive structure. Every single time Senator Klobuchar presented a heavily documented, publicly available quote, Patel actively and deliberately created an artificial wall of distance between himself and reality. Whenever she successfully locked a controversial claim to a specific, undeniable date and a completely verifiable public source, he instinctively retreated into a manufactured void of missing paperwork and conveniently absent memory. If you step back and analyze this intense interaction through an objective, analytical lens, you quickly realize that you are absolutely not watching a traditional, spirited political debate regarding differing philosophies of governance. You are, in fact, witnessing a fundamental, catastrophic breakdown in the core, unspoken agreement that governs the entire concept of giving sworn testimony. The very act of giving testimony inherently relies upon the basic, foundational assumption that a competent witness retains the ability to recognize their own historical voice. It assumes that an individual seeking immense governmental power possesses the intellectual and moral capacity to either stand proudly behind their past statements, provide necessary nuance and contextualize them, or cleanly, honestly, and fully disavow them if they no longer hold those beliefs to be true. A massive, potentially disqualifying problem arises when a nominated witness actively chooses to treat their own extensive, highly lucrative public history as an inaccessible, completely foreign object, an alien artifact that simply cannot be comprehended or addressed without a freshly printed transcript resting comfortably on the mahogany desk in front of them. Senator Klobuchar, a seasoned prosecutor and experienced legislator, knew exactly what kind of inescapable trap she was meticulously building. Her ultimate goal was never to secure a fleeting, dramatic verbal victory for the evening news broadcasts, nor was it to simply generate a viral clip for social media. She was engaged in a much more serious endeavor. She was brick by brick, constructing an airtight, permanent, and historically damning record that absolutely no amount of polished political performance, slick rhetoric, or evasive maneuvering could ever dismantle or erase. Having thoroughly exposed his evasion on matters of democratic integrity, she then seamlessly transitioned the focus of the hearing from explosive political controversies directly to a critical matter of public health and safety. She pointed out, with clinical precision, that he had previously used his public platform to aggressively promote a specific COVID-19 dietary supplement, a product that recklessly claimed to possess the medical ability to magically reverse or mitigate the side effects of life-saving vaccines. To contrast his claims with reality, she immediately introduced the prevailing, universally accepted scientific consensus, noting clearly that absolutely no such miracle cure had ever been scientifically validated by any reputable medical body on Earth, and that publicly endorsing such unproven remedies during a global health crisis was highly deceptive and incredibly dangerous to the public. When she leaned in and asked him directly if he had personally conducted rigorous, peer-reviewed clinical trials prior to broadcasting this massive medical claim to his audience, Patel finally, for the first time in the hearing, offered a somewhat direct, recognizable response. He quietly admitted the obvious reality that he was not a licensed physician, and he conceded that no, he had not personally run any scientific clinical trials on the supplement he was peddling. However, even this incredibly rare, fleeting moment of basic factual admission was immediately followed by a highly tactical, deeply cynical political pivot. He made absolutely no effort whatsoever to actually defend the underlying scientific validity of the product he had promoted. Furthermore, he completely failed to address the massive potential for genuine physical harm his reckless endorsement could have caused to vulnerable individuals desperately seeking medical advice. Instead, he smoothly reframed the entire issue, shifting the conversation entirely away from scientific truth and medical responsibility and anchoring it entirely around the abstract, politically popular concept of consumer choice. He asked the committee, somewhat rhetorically and with a hint of defiance, if he had not merely given American families the ultimate freedom and opportunity to make their own independent health decisions regarding what they put into their bodies. This slick, rehearsed response did not, in any way, actually address the core concern raised by the senator. It was a highly calculated, deeply manipulative redirection of his own moral and ethical responsibility. It was an attempt to disguise the promotion of medical misinformation as a noble crusade for personal liberty. Klobuchar, completely unfazed by the pivot, swiftly moved to anchor the timeline of this dangerous behavior, sharply noting that this specific promotion occurred just last year, not a decade ago in a different era, but in the very recent past. Cornered once again by proximity and fact, Patel immediately fell back on his most trusted, heavily utilized shield. He stared blankly and claimed, once more, that he simply did not have the specific information in front of him to verify his own recent action. At this critical juncture in the proceedings, the sheer, unrelenting repetition of his blatant evasions became a profound form of evidence in its very own right. Within a remarkably short, highly compressed span of under 8 minutes of questioning, Kash Patel deployed this exact, identical evasive formulation 7 distinct, separate times. 7 times. He looked a United States senator in the eye and outright refused to engage with the reality of his own undeniable, highly publicized commentary. With every single rhetorical dodge, with every refusal to own his words, the massive, glaring discrepancy between the two standards of justice in the room became the elephant that no one could ignore. There was the rigorous, unyielding accountability expected of an entry-level, rookie FBI field agent, an agent who could lose their entire career for a single, minor misrepresentation in a routine report. And sitting in stark, terrifying contrast was the incredibly lax, almost non-existent standard that the man nominated to be the absolute leader of that very same agency was openly and shamelessly applying to his own conduct. It grew entirely impossible for anyone watching the hearing to ignore the hypocrisy. The interrogation, however, was far from over. It continued to rapidly escalate, moving away from medical misinformation and directly into the terrifying realm of the weaponization of the federal government. Klobuchar turned the committee's attention to a specific, highly aggressive, and deeply alarming proposal he had allegedly made regarding the future of the justice system. She noted that he had publicly discussed utilizing the immense power of the federal government to aggressively prosecute former Justice Department officials. The alleged justification for this purge was based on incredibly sweeping, highly questionable legal theories regarding supposed unproven election interference. This was absolutely not a passing, fleeting thought uttered in a moment of frustration. It was a targeted, fleshed-out concept with profound, chilling legal consequences for the future of American democracy and the rule of law. When Klobuchar directly asked the nominee if he had, in fact, uttered those chilling words regarding the prosecution of his political enemies, Patel once again tried to awkwardly step sideways out of the spotlight. He aggressively accused the senator of unfairly reading a fragmented, cherry-picked quote, and he indignantly demanded the supposedly missing context that would miraculously make his threat sound reasonable. Unfazed by his bluster, and always one step ahead, the senator immediately provided the exact, precise context he demanded. She calmly cited his specific appearance on the controversial X22 Report podcast in the year 2023, effectively closing the trap he had just asked her to open. She then introduced a name that instantly and profoundly shifted the entire temperature and dynamic in the hearing room: former Attorney General Bill Barr. Because Bill Barr is a highly respected, immensely influential figure firmly entrenched within Patel's very own conservative political circles, the entire nature of the questioning underwent a massive transformation. It was no longer a theoretical debate about abstract, fringe legal theories or the hypothetical limits of executive power. It instantly transformed into a deeply uncomfortable, highly specific probe about the dark realities of personal retaliation, political vengeance, and the terrifying conflict between blind loyalty to a single political figure versus unwavering loyalty to the United States Constitution and the rule of law. Sensing the immense danger of the topic, Patel immediately denied harboring any sort of personal vendettas against the former Attorney General or anyone else. But as the committee had already seen repeatedly throughout the morning, simply issuing a blanket denial of an accusation without ever actually engaging with the underlying, documented statements is just another slightly different flavor of the exact same deflection he had been using all along. It was an empty denial built on a foundation of evasion. Senator Klobuchar, refusing to let the empty denial stand as the final word, countered his defense with devastating effectiveness. She did not use her own words. She read directly from Bill Barr's very own published, heavily circulated memoir. She read the passages where the former Attorney General of the United States explicitly and unequivocally described Kash Patel as fundamentally lacking the proper qualifications, the necessary temperament, and the essential experience required to run the nation's premier, most powerful law enforcement agency. The silence in the room was deafening as the words of his own political ally hung in the air. She then looked directly at the nominee and delivered a final, striking question that cut to the very core of his character and his nomination. She asked, point blank, if Patel's deep public animosity toward Barr was not based on any genuine legal philosophy or policy disagreement, but was simply born from the fact that Barr bravely refused to bend, break, and shatter the law for the benefit of a specific political leader. In that moment, the entire hearing was distilled into a single, terrifying question of allegiance. Was this the exact moment Kash Patel's confirmation unraveled before the eyes of the nation? By this critical stage in the proceedings, the fundamental nature of the hearing had irreversibly and profoundly mutated. It had completely ceased to be a standard, forward-looking interview regarding his hypothetical administrative plans and future policy goals for the Bureau. Instead, it had violently transformed into a relentless, forensic excavation of his past actions, his history of extreme public statements, and his shocking, glaring inability to honestly reconcile any of those past behaviors while sitting under the heavy, solemn obligation of a congressional oath. We must clearly and objectively evaluate the psychological dynamic of this pivotal moment playing out on screen. On one side of the grand committee room, you have Senator Amy Klobuchar, acting with surgical precision, systematically laying out a series of dated, fully sourced, and perfectly verifiable statements. Each and every one of these quotes was firmly anchored to a highly public platform that absolutely any everyday citizen sitting at home could easily fact-check on their smartphone. On the completely opposite side of the spectrum, you have the nominee reacting with a continuous, baffling display of complete absence. He stubbornly and repeatedly insisted that his own extensive, highly publicized history was entirely void and completely inaccessible unless it was physically handed to him in a neatly printed folder. This jarring contrast creates a massive moral paradox that simply cannot be brushed aside as mere political theater. Consider the reality of regular, everyday FBI field operatives working across the country. These dedicated men and women are absolutely never permitted to look their commanding superiors or a federal judge in the eye and casually state that they do not have their report sitting in front of them when their professional findings are being heavily scrutinized in a court of law. They are strictly and fundamentally forbidden from separating themselves from the official documents they have authored. They exist and operate in a high-stakes reality where a single poorly chosen word, or even a minor, seemingly insignificant inconsistency, can permanently obliterate a lifelong career in law enforcement. Therefore, we must ask, exactly what message is being sent when the very man actively auditioning to become their ultimate, supreme commander demands the right to operate under a wildly different, vastly more forgiving set of rules? What does it truly signify for the future of the justice system when the most basic, fundamental expectation of accurate memory and objective truth suddenly becomes a highly negotiable, incredibly flexible concept at the absolute pinnacle of federal power? This specific, glaring issue entirely transcends standard, everyday partisan politics. It is fundamentally not a debate about which political faction manages to gain a temporary advantage in the next election cycle. It strikes directly at the beating heart of whether the absolute most powerful and consequential seat in all of federal law enforcement is bound by the exact same strict integrity requirements as the rank-and-file agents who are actually working the streets and putting their lives on the line. If the rules are indeed different, if the leader is exempt from the standards applied to the subordinates, then the crisis unfolding in that room is much larger than Kash Patel alone. It is a massive crisis of the entire institutional framework of the United States. It forcefully compels us to wonder, with deep concern, if an organization that is entirely predicated upon documented truth and verifiable facts can functionally survive under the command of a leader who clearly views his very own historical record as an entirely optional convenience. If you watch the footage closely, you can actually feel how the ensuing uncomfortable silence in the room begins to carry far more profound weight than any of the spoken words. When a high-profile nominee aggressively and repeatedly avoids engaging with his own documented history, the heavy burden of truth does not simply vanish into thin air. It is merely transferred. It is cynically offloaded onto the frustrated senators sitting on the dais, onto the thousands of active agents watching the broadcast from their field offices, and onto the broader American public, who are left desperately trying to decipher objective reality from calculated political evasion. During that insidious transfer of responsibility, the fundamental public trust in the entire confirmation process begins to rapidly decay. Senator Klobuchar recognized this quiet psychological erosion perfectly, which is precisely why she maintained her steady, relentless acceleration of the fact. She absolutely refused to backtrack on her questioning. She steadfastly refused to demand emotional apologies that would only distract from the core issues, and she impressively never once raised her voice in an attempt to force a dramatic showdown. Instead, she just kept methodically stacking the irrefutable evidence higher and higher, continuously and ruthlessly shrinking the tiny amount of space where Patel's strategic ambiguity could possibly survive. In a structured hearing where the ticking clock is strictly monitored and weaponized to protect nominees, she understood that the factual record being built on that day would be eternal. Moving swiftly to the next piece of devastating evidence, she brought up a deeply controversial and widely debunked claim originating from December 2020. This specific claim involved wild allegations regarding international military satellites and the remote manipulation of American voting machines. This was absolutely not just some minor, harmless internet rumor floating around obscure message boards. It was a severe issue that was reportedly escalated all the way to the highest, most secure levels of the United States government. She looked at him and asked a direct, inescapable, binary question. Did he directly contact the acting Deputy Attorney General to demand the launch of a formal federal investigation into this bizarre, unfounded theory? Once again, the structure of the question was expertly designed to be completely impossible to honestly evade. However, Patel attempted to sidestep the core inquiry by heavily focusing on his prestigious title at that specific time. He argued that his prominent role as Chief of Staff at the Department of Defense made the scenario highly unlikely, before finally stating that he simply didn't believe the senator's accusation was accurate. The specific use of the word believe in this context is absolutely critical to understand. It is a lawyerly tactic that implies vast distance and convenient uncertainty, rather than providing a firm, factual, and definitive denial under oath. True to her established form, Klobuchar did not waste a single precious second arguing over his beliefs. She simply cemented previously sworn, official congressional testimony directly into the record to undeniably support her claim, wisely relying on concrete institutional documentation over the nominee's conveniently fuzzy, highly selective recollection. By this point, the behavioral pattern was fully and completely crystallized into an unbreakable, predictable loop. A factual statement is presented, hard documentation is provided, a deflection occurs, the permanent record is finalized, and the agonizing cycle repeats itself. This was a highly methodical, deeply surgical dissection of his credibility. Her ultimate goal was never to actually force him into an agreement, but rather to flawlessly demonstrate to absolutely everyone watching that he was entirely, fundamentally incapable of accounting for his own public life, while sitting under the intense pressure of a sworn oath. The intense interrogation then abruptly shifted toward his deeply troubling, aggressive rhetoric concerning the freedom of independent journalists. She directly asked if he had publicly categorized the media as the greatest enemy of the nation, sharply probing his underlying philosophical view of the vital institutions constitutionally meant to act as government watchdog. Unsurprisingly, Patel instantly reverted to his practiced defensive script, bitterly complaining that she was merely reading a single, isolated quote, devoid of meaning. But Klobuchar was vastly overprepared for this tired excuse. She immediately referenced multiple different public appearances spanning across both 2023 and 2024. She then proceeded to read an even more alarming, highly specific follow-up quote, where he enthusiastically promised to use massive legal avenues, both criminal and civil, to aggressively pursue and prosecute working journalists. This wasn't just tough political talk for a friendly audience. It was a clearly stated, horrifying intent to weaponize the immense power of the American legal system directly against the free press. When Klobuchar forcefully asked if he finally owned these aggressive, threatening words, Patel once again retreated into the shadows, weakly claiming the statement was only partial. Klobuchar immediately shut down the pathetic excuse by specifically citing Steve Bannon's widely listened-to podcast as the exact, verifiable source. She then calmly read yet another disturbing quote, declaring a clear intent to actively target the entire mainstream press corps. And his final response? It was the exact, hollow phrase absolutely everyone in the room had painfully come to expect. He simply claimed he did not have it in front of him. While the phrase landed exactly as it had before, its collective damage was massive. By constantly deploying this specific excuse, Patel was doing much more than avoiding a tough question. He was actively attempting to rewrite the rules of accountability in real time. He was trying to establish a bizarre precedent where a person's public history ceases to exist unless it is physically handed to them on a silver platter inside a highly controlled environment. When you place this customized standard next to the brutal expectations placed upon everyday FBI employees who must defend reports written years ago and who understand that their words have enduring consequences, the structural hypocrisy is blinding. Senator Klobuchar understood this, and she pressed even deeper. She had successfully proven that this was not a matter of a single misunderstood comment, but rather a deeply ingrained communication style that completely collapses when exposed to direct, factual scrutiny. She then deployed the most damaging piece of evidence yet, cutting straight to the existential core of the agency. She bluntly asked if he had advocated for shutting down the FBI's main headquarters and transforming the building into a museum dedicated to conspiracy theories. The atmosphere in the chamber shifted perceptibly. This was not about ancient election grievances or media vendettas. This was about the literal and symbolic destruction of the central nervous system of the organization he was asking to lead. This is the building where the nation's most sensitive intelligence is synthesized and where critical security protocols are coordinated. The horrifying reality was whether an individual who publicly fantasized about dismantling the agency could possibly be trusted to manage it. Patel offered no direct response, and the resulting silence was deafening. When the committee chairman attempted to abruptly move the proceedings along to maintain the schedule, Klobuchar shattered the rhythm. She fiercely refused to drop the issue, demanding an answer and reminding the entire room that a man seeking to lead the FBI had previously demanded its physical closure. This was the absolute center of the debate. Her unyielding insistence fundamentally altered the optics of the hearing. The nominee's refusal to answer was no longer perceived as a clever legal maneuver. It was exposed as a critical failure. Although the hearing momentarily devolved into procedural squabbles over speaking time, the massive, unanswered question hovered over the room, carrying significantly more devastating weight than any scripted PR answer could have achieved. It became a permanent fixture in the record of a man who selectively curates his own reality. When Patel was finally granted the floor, he predictably ignored the question about the headquarters entirely. Instead, he attempted a grand rhetorical reframing, labeling the entirely factual quotes as false accusations and grotesque mischaracterizations without actually disproving a single word. He masterfully attempted to shift the focus from objective verification to subjective victimhood. He immediately pivoted back to praising the frontline agents, attempting to fuse his own deeply compromised credibility with their undeniable heroism, implying that Klobuchar's factual inquiries were somehow an attack on the FBI itself. While it was a slick political maneuver, it was a profound logical failure. Offering generic praise to federal agents does not erase the radical statements he made on podcasts. Expressing admiration for the badge does not magically delete his prior demands to tear down the institution. He was attempting to build emotional bridges over a massive canyon of missing evidence. He continued by reciting his resume, touting his past roles in national security, trying to build a shield of personal sacrifice. However, his resume was never under attack. His willingness to be truthful and consistent under oath was the central crisis. The true test was whether he possessed the integrity to apply the law impartially and own his words in a formal setting. He culminated his defense by leaning heavily on an endorsement from massive law enforcement organizations, using the sheer volume of his supporters as a replacement for transparency. But staggering numbers cannot rewrite history. Endorsements are completely incapable of answering tough questions, and popularity cannot magically resolve the glaring contradictions permanently cemented in the official record. Klobuchar refused to let his rhetorical escape hatch remain open. She dragged the focus forcefully back to reality, reminding him that she was merely repeating his own exact words from mere months ago. She clarified that there was no political spin, just his own verifiable history staring him in the face. At that crescendo, the ultimate truth of the hearing became perfectly clear. This was not a battle of opposing political viewpoints. It was a terrifying demonstration of a powerful nominee utterly refusing to acknowledge his own documented existence when cornered. Stripping away all the theatrical politics, the reality is that Amy Klobuchar presented a mountain of rigorously sourced facts, and Kash Patel chose to respond with calculated distance. This distance was not a neutral lapse in memory. It was a deliberate strategy to evade accountability and hide behind procedural confusion. The stakes of this evasion are monumentally high. If a potential FBI director simply will not engage with his own history while under oath, how can the public trust him to oversee incredibly complex investigations that require absolute precision? The Bureau cannot function on partial recall or conditional truth. It demands unshakable consistency and the ability to fiercely defend every piece of gathered intelligence. What was exposed was a catastrophic collision of two distinct standards: the strict rules applied to the hard-working agents and the highly flexible rules demanded by the man trying to become their boss. The central question was no longer about proving he made those statements. The undeniable record had already accomplished that. The only question left was analyzing his intent. Misplacing a date is a human error, but strategically and repeatedly abandoning your own words while under oath is a calculated maneuver that reveals a great deal about your character. Klobuchar brilliantly eliminated all the surrounding ambiguity, compressing months of scattered podcast bravado into a tight, inescapable timeline of accountability. She was no longer begging for straightforward answers, she was conducting a brutal stress test of his consistency. If a leader's convictions wildly fluctuate based on the room they are sitting in or the pressure they face, then their beliefs are inherently untrustworthy. Klobuchar successfully exposed a man who acts with supreme, aggressive certainty on friendly media platforms, but suddenly transforms into an amnesiac the moment he is asked to swear an oath in the Senate chamber. Consider the disastrous impact this would have within the culture of the FBI. If a field agent repeatedly told a judge, "I don't have that in front of me," while being questioned about their own case files, their career would instantly implode. They would be permanently flagged as unreliable. Yet, this identical behavior was being showcased by the potential head of the agency. The actual substance of the quotes makes this evasion even more terrifying. These were not casual slip-ups. He had pushed dangerous narratives about rigged voting systems, smeared brave police officers, peddled unscientific medical cures, threatened to criminally prosecute government rivals, promised to unleash legal warfare on journalists, and suggested physically shutting down the FBI's operational hub. Any one of these extreme claims warrants an intense investigation, but together, they demand absolute transparency. Instead of transparency, the committee received the exact same robotic dismissal 7 times. That specific phrase evolved from a weak excuse into a blazing warning siren. It signaled that he views truth as highly conditional, only valid when it benefits him in a controlled environment. In a job interview for a role that commands immense power over national security and individual liberty, this signal is deeply alarming. Leadership at this level is not about putting on a good show. It is about holding immense responsibility for actions that impact the integrity of the justice system. When the foundation of trust is fractured by the leader's own hypocrisy, the entire structure becomes vulnerable. There are severe, real-world consequences to this type of behavior. Amplifying baseless election conspiracies actively destroys the public's faith in democracy. Slandering police officers under oath degrades the validity of the entire judicial process. Promoting fake medical cures actively endangers human lives. The role he desires requires managing these exact types of crises with flawless evidence and strict procedure, making his performance profoundly disqualifying. Senator Klobuchar didn't need to loudly proclaim this moral failure. She let his own silence do the devastating work for her. By simply presenting the facts and watching him retreat, she created a negative space, where the lack of an answer became the most powerful argument in the room. The public does not need to guess what is happening. They only need to observe the massive gaps where the truth should be. If this deeply evasive pattern carried over into the actual daily operations of the FBI, the results would be catastrophic. How could the agency ever justify its actions to the public or the courts if the director's relationship with the truth is so fluid? Senator Klobuchar's victory was not in proving, he said, controversial things. It was in proving that he completely lacks the courage to stand by them when the pressure is real. When Patel tries to hide behind his resume and his endorsements, it creates a jarring disconnect. You cannot claim to deeply respect an institution while completely ignoring the rigorous standards of truth that keep that institution alive. The agents he claims to champion are strictly bound to their documentation. Yet he expects a completely free pass. This glaring double standard is the true threat to the system. If accountability is treated as a joke at the very top of the food chain, it will slowly poison everything below it. It establishes a terrifying new precedent where the rules only apply to those without power. By the conclusion of the hearing, the core debate was completely settled. It was clear that Patel could put on a slick performance, but it was equally clear that he refuses to be held accountable. Klobuchar built an absolute fortress of evidence out of undeniable public records, and Patel chose to run away from it rather than face it. He had every opportunity to engage, explain, or apologize, but he actively chose the coward's route of procedural distance. This cowardly strategy inevitably shifts a massive burden onto the entire system. How can the FBI function effectively when its leader views documented facts as merely negotiable suggestions? The agency relies entirely on precision. Replacing that precision with intentional ambiguity at the highest level sends a destructive signal to every single employee. Institutions inevitably mirror the morality of their leaders, slowly rotting from the inside out through a series of tiny, toxic allowances. Senator Klobuchar masterfully revealed this danger not through screaming, but through incredibly disciplined structure. She proved that facts must always matter, regardless of whether they are convenient or embarrassing. The FBI is not just another random government office, It is the ultimate defender of federal law, and its credibility is absolutely non-negotiable. What was dragged into the light was a deeply ingrained pattern of cowardice and inconsistency. Can an agency survive under a leader who demands accountability from his staff while expertly dodging it himself? Trust is never built through high-profile endorsements. It is forged entirely through a perfect alignment between what a person says and what a person actually does. The questions raised during this hearing are now permanently etched into the historical record. They will not be washed away by the next breaking news story. The undeniable truth established in that room is that he was presented with 7 documented facts, and 7 times he chose deflection over honesty. This is a severe failure of character that raises massive red flags about his fitness for command. Ultimately, titles and resumes are entirely meaningless if a person cannot be trusted to operate under the absolute highest standards of truth. Accountability demands that you own your words in every setting, without demanding a piece of paper to jog your memory. So, after witnessing this masterclass in evasion, what does this tell you about the future of our justice system? Do you believe the rules should apply equally to everyone, or are we entering an era where the powerful get to rewrite reality to suit their needs? No one, regardless of their title, should ever be considered above their own documented history. If you believe that true accountability must flow from the absolute top all the way down, then make your voice heard. Engage with this discussion, share these facts, and help ensure that these critical moments of exposure are permanently remembered and thoroughly understood.